It's no secret by this point, I'm fucking old. And at least by modern day internet standards, where being closer and closer to your 30s and above is basically being treated like you're one step closer to going to the old folks' home, as it were. As I write this and even potentially record this, I am about to turn 28, and I've been doing stuff online for about half my life by now by this point, in one way or another. And during that time, it's given me a sense of pause on the kinds of things that I and many others around me have done in regards to our online footprint. I myself have done many things online in the last 14 years of life, of which this latest streak of nearly 4 years now has been my most successful run on the internet probably ever, and it's no small part due to the fact I've managed to learn a lot about what I've done since starting up online. Content creation. But with what you've no doubt expected by this point, what exactly does this entail for today's topic of sorts? Well, that's part of it. But it does tie a little bit into what today's major talking point, which is the topic of internet identity. Because it's one thing for me to have been successful in what I've done on this persona, as it were, but it begs the question of how many personas does any one person have in the online landscape? And that kind of thing basically became a lot more prevalent with the advent of queer identity online becoming a lot more accepted of a thing for those who couldn't yet venture out into the world and live what could be their supposed truths in person. From MMOs or chat rooms and message boards or social games like Habbo Hotel. There's a lot of places, both back when I was younger and even now, where that kind of thing is more or less a way for those who live under the queer umbrella to truly find themselves in through different personas and different monikers. And that line of thinking brought me back around to one particular anime, which, in a way, kind of predicted a lot of what we have to reckon with today, both in terms of identity, as much as we do on the online landscape, and how technology is part and parcel of how we've managed to explore ourselves. Or rather, figure out who we are in the wires.
And you don't seem to understand.
Welcome to the Otaku Project. Welcome to In Transition, a mini video series discussing the various thoughts, feelings, and views on the differing bits of media that have helped me on my ongoing journey to being the woman I am today. And today, we're logging on to the wire to give our love to an almighty deity that lives within it, or so we may believe ourselves to believe anyway, as we look into the world of Serial Experiments Lain. Now, I talked a lot at the beginning of this over how online identity and queer identity becoming more prevalent are basically a big correlation, and that is not at all surprising that the more online spaces have popped up in the last 3 decades of the internet being around, that we've managed to see a lot of queer exploration come about as a result. Especially given the anonymity of many places nowadays, ones I've talked about at length such as 4chan, Twitter, and the like. But would you really believe that it's always been kind of like this in terms of the internet being a place of this kind of environment? Hell, even when I was starting to use it, it was something which basically was an unspoken rule that in terms of your identity, you could basically be anyone. And that was both a blessing for many people as it was a curse for the entirety of those who were using the internet at that period of time. Something which I feel Lain covers both aspects of in frighteningly real details. Given all of this was written and done around about the time of the internet was arguably still in its infancy during the late 90s in 1998, the way that Lain really explores a lot of what the internet could be was something which future anime in the vein of Dot Hack, Then Recoil, and Summer Wars would down the line. But Lain would look not just at how the internet was this big landscape of sorts that could be used for the good of society, but it also very much delved into the kinds of despicable and deviant actions that it could be known for as well. In fact, Lain makes it very clear that for as much as the internet was a brave new world at that period of time, that it could be easily used for very devious things. So it was equally as much a reflection on where we could go potentially as a society in the digital age, as much as it was showing of how much impressive the online world could be. This was in no short part due to how Lain's creation came almost at the most perfect time, just around before the new millennium was set to hit, and right before we would begin to see such stories told in much more heightened detail and nuance like we have seen since then. especially given a lot of what has been predicted basically has become normalized today. Long gone are the days where the internet was seen as this niche little corner of society that only a small pocket of people have become invested in. Since Lane's overall impact in the anime market, the world has embraced the internet to a degree where, arguably, it's almost impossible to log yourself off from it. Much how Lane mentions, no matter where you are, everyone's connected. And, for better or for worse, depending on how you choose to end up interpreting that statement and its meaning today for the current digital landscape we find ourselves locked onto, it's a clear indication that for as much as we think ourselves in real life are separate from our online personas, in reality, it's a lot more intertwined than one may think on the matter, especially in an age where said personas between each side are so blurred that they could essentially be one and the same, or even a little bit more splintered than we may think. Oh. What? Oh, right, but getting a bit too ahead of myself on oh my god, we're actually living in a weird dystopian nightmare of a world tangent there. What does this all mean for the topic of Lane, and more importantly, what importance does this serve in regards to queer and trans identity? Well, what if I told you that the evolution of the internet since Lane's debut and the rise of queer identity was pretty much hand in hand due to the fact that as the internet has grown into this much wider to access medium, do we find that as time has gone on, it's become arguably a lot easier for us to essentially find places online to show off our different sides in many different ways. Now, let it never be said that what we cover on here isn't topical, because holy shit, sometimes I feel like the way I talk about things on here makes me sound like a pretentious zoomer or a borderline boomer at points. But the point here is that the sentiment is that the way that we have basically begun to see ourselves in modern society all really stems from the way that the internet has helped in a very monkey's paw sort of way with how we show ourselves to everyone else. And that, like I just said, has left us in an interesting place in the global sphere because the nature of the internet is, well, to borrow a very notorious phrase, it's forever, and however much we think we can control of it is laughable at best and depressing to consider at its worst. I feel I can literally name the amount of times in the last 4 years of transitioning alone I've seen people that I've been following for years have their entire online presence completely picked apart due to some kind of issue stemming from years ago being brought up. And the sad part of it is, I don't have to name anyone in particular because you watching this right now have had one or two immediate examples floating around in your brain, and they would be correct with what we're looking at. And regardless of if they deserve the public scrutiny or not, especially whether or not you want to use the specific phrase to describe what has happened to them as being accurate or not, the whole point behind it is simple. Your actions online will eventually come back to haunt you if you're not careful about what you want to do on it. With the sad reality of it being, people either really don't care enough about that kind of thing nowadays to where they feel emboldened to just spew hate speech or bigotry on these platforms due to the people running them either not caring in the slightest or basically bankrolling the algorithms to support them doing it. But what does that lead back to Lane on? Well, more than you may think. See, Lane as a series basically looks at the entire point of how the online world and I hate to call it the real world because nothing about this world really feels real anymore, but fuck it, yes, the real world are basically one and the same at many points of time. To the point where it could be argued throughout it that the line between the two becomes so paper thin that Lane herself doesn't know where the wire begins and her reality ends. Because if everything is as connected as she thinks, what does trying to find the difference really mean at the end of the day? And that could just as easily be said about how queer people often begin to find out more about themselves as a result. Going back to the different pseudonyms and identities, trans people often use these ideas to, more often than not, explore more about themselves to try and figure out their personal identities. In fact, I knew a lot of people who came out between the 2010s to now who actually used this to try and see how being perceived as feminine would go for them, while others I know utilized role-playing as a way to try and see how that could work for them, and they, more often than not, ended up coming out within a year of beginning this kind of thing. This being a prime example of how the borders between online presence and real-world identity can, in fact, have long-lasting influence as the borders between the two become a lot thinner as a result of this becoming more prevalent. Wait, is that even what Lain is trying to say? Whatever, it works for what we're trying to go for here. Regardless of how you choose to look at it, however, the way that Lain more or less is a progenitor of the blurring lines of what we have presented ourselves as online becoming more and more real over time is both a good and a bad thing, whichever way you choose to look at it. Because on one hand, it's certainly a good thing for us to be able to have had and continue in certain ways to have these spaces for online expression in a semi-anonymous setting and to cover up if need be through hiding differing identities and pseudonyms online in that fashion. On the other hand, well, it's certainly a lot more complicated for the ways that using those same kinds of tactics affects people in a negative sense. But more so because of how much more expansive the looking view of identity has become since Lain debuted. See, despite what we take for granted today in the era of social media, and basically having no second thoughts on plastering our names, faces, and what have you online, back when Lain first came about, everyone went under a pseudonym. For the most part, anyway. In fact, in my experience at least, I knew several people who went by a different pseudonym on every corner of the internet for various different things, only having one or two select default usernames for everything to be identified under because that's simply an easier way to keep tabs on where they are. But that line of thinking of having a different bit of identity in a different corner of the internet with different usernames to try and differentiate themselves for every niche they found themselves in, doesn't that sound at all familiar to today's topic? Yeah, one of the bigger things that Lain really talks about is how differentiated identities through different landscapes of the internet are commonplace, with none more showing it off than Lain Iwakawa herself, who has 3 different entire personalities shown within her time in The Wired. First being the main Lain, showcased as being more stoic and could be mistaken as apathetic, if not almost infatuation with the technological world of The Wired, despite the protests of those around her, is the closest we get to a representation of the identity we put on for those around us in our daily lives, as sort of a baseline of sorts. With the Lain that we see in The Wired itself as the identity we can put on for those in an online capacity. In a world of anonymity, you can be anyone after all, so why wouldn't you want to be the kind of person who you aren't in the flesh? Be it a much more stern and even more active participant like Lain ends up being through The Wired, or even perhaps a different gender as well. One could argue Wired Lain represents the one for everyone to want to be a more idealized self in a place where there is no history set. And then we get Evil Lain, the self of which we probably see ourselves in at our very worst. Be it through our anxieties or paranoia or what have you, Evil Lain shows us what we could be if we let the worst parts of ourselves loose and be shown for the world to see. Potentially, anyway. Really, all the layers of Lain's identity throughout all parts of the series showcase the various levels of how identity shapes us in both the digital landscape as well as it does in the world we live in physically. As much as identity can be controlled by us in the digital landscape. Hell, Lain herself even verbally broaches this topic near the end of the series by openly talking about how humans can only exist within the memories of others, and how that means that there are several different versions of oneself in everyday life through no fault of their own. It's a perfect showing that, for as much as we would like to control our perception and how we're all viewed throughout our lives, be it online or offline, our control is very much dependent on the viewpoints of others around us as much as it is ourselves. And that it needs to be reminded that we're all just subjects to how we're perceived in our day-to-day lives through those around us, be it digitally or otherwise. Whichever mask we end up taking up is all subject to who we are at the end of it all. Wait, wasn't this meant to be about queer identity? Point here is, No matter which way you choose to indulge in with a show like Lain in terms of personal identity, queer identity, or what have you, it's clear through either interpretation that Lain does indeed have a lot to offer up in terms of how modern identity exploration has changed, arguably for the better. And it's thanks in part to anime like Lain that broke ground in not just talking about these types of topics, but also showing how important it is for the internet itself in terms of how you can manage more about yourself more than ever. Nowhere is that as prevalent as it is today. And I genuinely feel proud to be a part of the group in the online sphere that takes pride in being able to say that we've discovered more about ourselves through this manner of self-discovery. And in general, I think my generation and even the generations following on from mine have a lot to thank from media like Lain for allowing this kind of discussion to be prevalent and to allow such methods of modern day internet to be where we are today. And really, that's what keeps us all connected at the end of all, in a bit of a scary way. With all that being said, until next time, Jamata! No, we're done here. I gotta go sort something out. Hey! Tell the Prime we need to have a talk! Now!
What do you want?
What do I want? I want to know what the hell is going on around here. Ever since that Full Metal Alchemist look-through I did a while ago, things have been really fucky around here, and I deserve to know what's going on around here.
What good would it do?
It would be better than keeping me in the dark about what's been happening with the vessel. She, of all people, deserves better than what has been happening to her lately. Make it quick. I need to go see the reviewer. I'm assuming you're referring to the incidents where you've been flung out of control of the vessel? Yes. This has never happened before since I came around. And it all just started to escalate during that Higurashi retrospective when that witch referred to a reviewer amongst us. And then I noticed something that made my head tilt in the set that we have. There's anime posters that weren't there before that look tattered and aged. Like they've been there longer than I have. Prime, I deserve to know the truth. Who is the reviewer? The reviewer was one of the Prime personalities long before either of us took form. They were a part of the vessel long before either of us were formed, and when we were, it was decided they were no longer needed. As such, they were put under lock and keep into an area which nobody would think to look in the vessel, for our own good. Where is it then? Don't! They were sealed away for a good reason. The interruptions are proof of it. It's best we just get rid of them now and just be done with it. And then what? We set the precedent that any one of us can be taken care of like that when our usefulness has expired? Is that really what you want to have us live in fear of, there, Prime? All because this one instance frightens you so much? Look, you know as well as I do, the vessel is going to need them eventually. And if they're breaking through so harshly like what we've been dealing with lately, it's a sign that it's finally time that they are released from their prison. If anything else, they deserve better treatment than being locked away forever. And being upfront here, we're going to need their help sooner rather than later. And if you really want to help the vessel in the long term, we need the reviewer. They're in the deepest part of the vessel's psyche, somewhere nobody has been for years. If you truly wish to bring them back, you'll find them there. But let's be clear about something here, storyteller. Whatever happens as a result of this, be it they finally come out or you get harmed as a result of this, or God help you if this affects the vessel negatively, everything that happens, you are responsible for going forward.
This video was made possible through supporter patrons like the ones you're seeing on screen right now. If you like videos like this one and others on this channel, please consider supporting them via the Patreon link and subscribing to the channel. Thank you for the time, and catch you later.